This is the Latin News Podcast. I am your host, Richard McCall, here in Colombia. Our very special guest this week perhaps needs no introduction. He's been on the show before. We discussed China's influence in Latin America. It's a great pleasure to have back on the Latin News Podcast Dr. Evan Ellis, Latin American Research Professor and General MacArthur Research Chair at the U.S. Army War College.
Richard, it's a real pleasure to be on the podcast with you here today.
No, the pleasure is ours because previously your podcast has been one of the most popular in this series, but this time we're not discussing China directly. What we'll be discussing a hot topic, of course. Every day something pops up in the news and the mainstream press and elsewhere. Venezuela and the United States. We've been having the destruction of alleged drugs boats or boats shipping narcotics from Venezuela, supposedly to the United States. We've been having commentary from both sides, of course, from Hegseth up in the United States, Maduro in Venezuela. Perhaps we just start from the very basics. What is going on?
It's a great question. And I think things are happening at multiple different levels. So to begin with, obviously, the broader context is understanding that Maduro and his regime has been a strategic challenge to the United States for a number of different reasons, both during the first and second Trump administration. We can recall, of course, that the work during the first administration, when I was on the policy planning staff of Secretary Pompeo at State, the work that we did to try to restore the de jure governor Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela. That, unfortunately, did not work out despite continuous efforts through sanctions and other things. And I would certainly say that probably the focus of the first Trump administration was much more on, again, trying to restore that legitimate democratic government. And I mention that because even back then, there was an understanding that the nature of the challenges presented by Venezuela included not only democracy for democracy's sake and the departure of what's now over 8 million Venezuelans, but in addition, you had Venezuela hosting under Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro various activities by the PRC, by Russia, by Iran, Venezuelan airlines like Emtrasur being used to fly Iranian Quds Forces operatives and Hezbollah operatives around the region, including to Argentina. The hosting of Russian military equipment, Russian advisors, Wagner Group, certainly a large number of Chinese activities. And, of course, the hosting of a number of different guerrilla and terrorist groups, including the ELN, which also, of course, operates in Colombia, various remnants of the FARC, various representatives of other groups, and the destabilizing effect that hosting had on neighboring Colombia and others. And so really for quite some time, Venezuela in multiple different ways has been a host of strategic threats to the United States and a force of destabilization in the region. The second time around, of course, President Trump has come in with a focus really on migration flows and drug flows. And I think really what you've seen here is that in this focus, the fact that the really criminal franchise that the Venezuelan government has become through Tren de Aragua, what was once a prison gang, which has been exploiting Venezuelan immigrants in the United States and elsewhere, but it brought violence to U.S. cities. And also, of course, the Cartel de las Solas, the partially military affiliated cartel, but more also involved in extorting remittances, involving in illegal mining activities, involved in just about everything else. But the contribution of Cartel de Solas to drug trafficking, and especially at a time when you have over 100,000 Americans that die every year from drug overdoses. And so, certainly the focus of the second Trump administration has been on that piece of the threat. And you can understand that in that you had the deployment, as we've seen, of a very large force. It's a force that is really capable of doing major strike operations to grab Maduro and the rest of the Cartel de las Solas leadership, doing far more than what it has done to date, which is use lethal force against 4, perhaps 5 different drug boats. And I would just mention to that you have not only the 4 destroyers that are there and the 1 Ticonderoga class cruiser, which between them have, by my count, over 500 missile tubes, VLS tubes. And of course, if you ever wanted to do a takedown of the largely Russian supplied air defenses, that would be more than enough to do that. Leadership targets, most of the older generation F-16s and Sukhoi 30s. They're on the ground, and really just about any other key threat. But also you have 3 amphibious ships. One, the Wasp, which is essentially a helicopter carrier. Basically, it's capable of launching those V-22 Ospreys, other transport helicopters, attack helicopters such as the Cobra, the AV-8B Harrier, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, among others. And then you have 2 other ships called LHDs who can mount some helicopters, but really their core role is launching these very quick over the beach ships called LCACs. And so essentially the bottom line is that you have more than enough capability if the Trump administration decided to basically use information about where Maduro is, especially with the help of that $50 million reward that's been offered to work with those close to him to go in and take him down. But at the same time, I don't think Trump is quite there yet. What my sense is, if you look at the way that the president also operated with respect to Iran and the strikes against Fordo and other nuclear facilities, my general sense, and also having worked with the administration, the first administration, is that President Trump really likes to try to avoid using military force if he can avoid it. So my sense is that right now we're in a situation where, with the deployment of the substantial task force, time is on the president's side. He has clearly showed that he's willing to use lethal force. He's given the legal justification for that with Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization. There's now rumors, or at least it's come out, discussions regarding the possibility of land strikes. And so, if you're sitting there with Nicolas Maduro in a bunker in Caracas or wherever his bunker is right now, you see the U.S. go after a land target with perhaps a cruise missile, and you're thinking, that cruise missile or that bunker buster munition could just as easily been against the bunker where I'm sitting with Maduro right now. And so that sense that an attack is imminent, I sense the Trump administration hopes that, understanding the imminent nature of the attack, that the military who have long worked with Maduro will at least in part try to save themselves and lead to a situation where the U.S. doesn't have to do an attack. But I could see, at least in the next couple months, at least until we get into November, December, that you could see the administration doing more and more things. But at the end of the day, because Trump had to walk away last time, ceding power to Joe Biden, leaving Nicolas Maduro in power, that I think this time around, my sense is the president's patience has run out. And so while we might not actually see a large-scale U.S. attack this week, my sense is time is on the president's side, and it's really hard for me to see this ending with Nicolas Maduro remaining in power, although all things are still possible.
As you said, all things are very much still possible. The increase of that reward on Nicolas Maduro's head, to $50 million, has to have increased paranoia within his inner circle, and of course himself. As you suggest, hopefully that this is let's say a bloodless exchange or in power or turnover. Someone in the inner circle turns on him, sort of, the stabbing Caesar in the back kind of thing, and that the US don't have to go in. But if it were to become more belligerent, do you think that there's a plan for the US to occupy Venezuela? This is one thing, with so much mobilization of military hardware in the Caribbean and into Puerto Rico and so on. It feels, you get the feeling of Panama back in the day, and Noriega. But of course, it's not the same.
No, it's a great question. And I absolutely believe that there are plans for how you do a major military operation. And I'm confident that there is ongoing coordination with the opposition, with Maria Corina Machado, with Edmundo González, et cetera. And also, I think has now been reported, and so we can actually say it, that, there are these rumors of, key members within the Venezuelan military and others talking both to the opposition as well as to persons in the United States. But I don't expect a 1989 Operation Just Cause type of operation where there would be some sort of even brief occupation and a path to try to create a democratic government. My sense, much like the U.S. attacks on Iran, on Fordo and other sites, the intention would be to essentially remove the problem. In this case, the problem being the leadership of the Cartel de los Soles, which certainly would probably be Nicolas Maduro, Jorge Delcy Rodriguez, Cabello, among others. with the exception of whoever probably decides to try to cut deals with the United States. I think there would be in the absence of those leaders, there would be a window of opportunity in which clearly Edmundo González was elected by 70% of the Venezuelan population. Everyone in Venezuela, including the military officers who are there in their barracks, know it. And so when that current leadership disappears, there's going to be an immediate need for legitimacy. And so the natural tendency is going to be to turn to the leader that everyone knows was actually elected, especially if it's a U.S. military solution that brings that about. The question then becomes that can Edmundo González, can Maria Corina Machado take advantage of that window in order to use probably some fleeting initial control over Venezuela, whatever Venezuelan generals pledge their loyalty, etc., to first establish order, because we have to keep in mind that probably 80% of the criminal elements in the country don't want that order, because order suggests accountability for their crimes. It suggests accountability for the human rights violations that the UN and also inter-American human rights organizations have already well documented. And so the tendency is going to be that the more radicalized members of the militias, the colectivos, the groups such as the elements of the ELN and the FARC who have been operating in Venezuela, they're going to want to stir up trouble. Those military commanders who are more radicalized and see an opportunity to try to destabilize the new regime in Caracas, and certainly the Russians and Cubans who have a strategic interest in trying to stir up as much trouble as possible for the strategic benefit of trying to pin all of the chaos that could happen on the United States. And so at the end of the day, you have whoever takes power is going to have to address those challenges. And then after that, you have the issue of restoring Venezuelan oil production and preventing people from sabotaging it. You have the issue of dealing with all the legal cases, everything from preventing Citgo from being essentially sold off as is going forward with the New York court, to dealing with diplomatic representation, to dealing with cases, for example, the case over Esquivo in the International Criminal Court, et cetera, et cetera. And so really, it's going to be, I would say, probably one of the most incredibly difficult responsibilities of whoever comes into power. And also, I should say that that's actually the good scenario, because that implies that the U.S. has come in and removed all of the key figures, taken them to justice or otherwise taken them out. However, if there's a deal cut short of a U.S. military intervention, that implies that Maria Corina is on shake your hand, because she is essentially in the position where she and Edmundo González have to essentially pardon and perhaps do essentially devil's deals with military who are known to be dirty, who are known to be corrupt. And so the government has even more of a legitimacy problem and even more of a problem of who's in control, something that, again, the other criminal elements can play to, the Russians and Cubans can play to. And so is there a plan? I would say yes. Is that plan fraught with difficulties? I would say absolutely yes. But I think that the key thing is that for those who are expecting a U.S. occupation, aka Iraq, Afghanistan, Operation Just Cause, first of all, really the force that's currently assembled is more than enough to grab the leadership targets, especially with the help of that reward money. But it's not the size of an occupation force. And moreover, I think there's the understanding that the force that's brought in, any long-term occupation, number one, President Trump has said time and time again that these are not the type of things that he wants, these costly long-term things. There's also the understanding that if you remain on ground, that's exactly what many on the left want, a U.S. target where they can make this about a nationalist resistance and not essentially their criminal hijacking of a democratic regime. And so the faster you can get the elected leader of Venezuela, Edmundo González, and his team up there in power and hand it over, just like after the Fordo strikes, President Trump declared success and said, okay, your responsibility now. So it's going to be very tricky, but that's my sense of where things are going right now.
Very tricky. Not impossible, but again, fraught with challenges. I do believe that the Edmundo González, Maria Corina Machado have in place a 100-day sort of plan of the sort of turnover. But as you suggested as well, as it seems to me that there's this huge issue of having to amnesty all of these generals and upper leading, because that's how the regime has stayed in play. It's basically looking or turning a blind eye to the criminality of all of these officers, and then of course loading the courts with your cronies. So to replace them all in one fell swoop, while it sounds ideal, is nigh on impossible. The other thing that really occurs to me in this moment is the U.S. reputation of its involvement in Latin America is certainly going to give rise to some outspoken figures, not least President Petro, where I am now in Colombia, who is already speaking out about various issues. He loves, a populist cause. Do you see this increasing elsewhere in the region?
Well, you make a great point, and that is that certainly among the left, this is going to give a lot of fuel to the fire. I think one of the great miscalculations that many on the left and really many across the political spectrum have made with this current Trump administration is the presumption that things that we have really sacrificed and invested a lot of capital for in the past, essentially to be, liked and loved. One can think of, USAID programs. We can think of Voice of America. We can think of other programs. This is much more a realist, or I should say even a neo-realist president and presidential team. The application of national power and seeing how the understanding of U.S. economic power and military power shapes the decision and causes people, for better or worse, to essentially kneel to the ring of that. And so my suspicion is that, well, of course, Gustavo Petro, even like he was making a lot of hay about, Colombians, being taken out in the latest attack against the drug boat. And of course, the irony is, well, of course, there were Colombians in that boat, or at least I suspect that there were, because for a long time, it's actually been Colombian narco groups who have prospered even more under Petro's mistaken policies, who have been running those drugs and interfacing and taking those drugs out through Venezuela. So yes, that should tell you something about the problematic nature of the Petro government. The question becomes in Brazil as well. Of course, just like Lula has tried to reach out in multilateral means through the BRICS, through his UN General Assembly, a speech and other things to rally against perceived U.S. bullying, clearly he'll do that. Indeed, one of the interesting scenarios that a number of us have talked about is the prospect that Lula himself might be prepared to offer sanctuary to Nicolas Maduro. In other words, once you see that presidential jet, flying south out of Caracas and not north, but south towards Brazil, that would create a situation in which Lula could literally say, look, I used good Brazilian democracy and diplomacy, and I solved this as a way of essentially increasing his international creds against the Trump administration. But I think you will see the predictable range of everything from Sao Paulo Forum to opportunistic sniping from the Russians, from the Cubans, probably from the Democratic left as well, although perhaps a little bit more restrained. You will see it, of course, from China, who, after having done nothing to stop the invasion against their very close economic ally, the Ukraine, will now protest against the use of force. So I think you will see all the predictable discourse, but the reality will be that if the U.S. shows its willingness to use military force, if it doesn't get bogged down in a conflict, and the other big if is that if the situation in Venezuela doesn't just degenerate into criminal chaos, as we talked about before, leading to a longer term discussion of, well, the U.S. caused this, the U.S. broke it, and now the U.S. owns it. But if there is a relatively successful restoration of democracy, thanks to the U.S. role, just like there was a sense that the U.S. helped Israel to take Iran and its nuclear program down a peg. I think after all of the predictable rhetoric and grumbling, it will actually change in a very positive direction. Maybe not positive in terms of embrace and love, but positive in the sense of a heightened willingness of some in Latin America to respect how the U.S. might act in the future. It goes back to Machiavelli, and is it better to be feared or loved? In the end, it's both. But with this administration, that's kind of the terrain we're in, I think, with our actions possibly in dealing with Maduro.
Fascinating. And maybe we could ask, where do, let's say, you said that China didn't get involved in Ukraine, a big partner and so on, but China and Russia and Cuba obviously play a huge part here, and they're all watching very keenly. But are they involved behind the scenes? I know that we have Qatar trying to act as a sort of a go-between. Is there a go-between between the, let's say, one axis and the other, US and allies, and so let's say Russia, China? Is Qatar acting as a bridge between the two?
But it's an interesting question, and specific to Qatar, of course, this was just announced that the Qatar is reaching out and offering mediation, and I think on the one hand that reflects its rising star with its role with President Trump and with Koff in the negotiations over Israel and Gaza. But beyond that, it also ironically reflects some of the Middle Eastern ties with a number of different actors that developed, and not just Iran, with Maduro, and especially with his previous oil minister Tariq al-Assami and his Lebanese connections. But beyond that, I think if you look at, and it remains to be seen whether Qatar will be brought in some sort of role or no. I suspect that probably that would not be welcomed by the U.S. because that would only really dilute the credit and complicate things. Because at the end of the day, this is not about a misunderstanding between the U.S. and Venezuela or an accidental escalation. This is about a President Trump who is, I probably think, tired of playing games with Maduro, tired of allowing Maduro to be a thorn in the side, and so essentially taking this in a direction until Maduro either cedes or leaves or is made to leave by others. But to address the other actors, it is interesting how low of a profile these other actors that used to play a prominent role in Venezuela. This isn't to say that they're not doing covert things, but for example, if you look at Iran, and of course, Iran has been greatly weakened by Israel. Hezbollah with the attacks in Lebanon have been greatly weakened by Israel. And so my sense is it's interesting to see how very little Iran has even said about what's going on. Beyond that, you have Russia, of course, remembering that so much of what would defend Venezuela, or at least would become targets if the U.S. does a strike. Those S-300 missile batteries, which again, they're not nothing, but they're not the S-400s that the Turks want to buy and that have been negotiated to with India, among others. If you look at the BM-3 armored vehicles, the Sukhoi 30s, the coastal air defense systems, a range of different things, the Russian advisors that have gone in not only to do exercises but to keep those systems alive. And so it's interesting that you certainly haven't seen any Russian noise about defending Venezuela against attack. They've got their own problems right now, and even the ships that came over for show, such as the Admiral Gorshkov that came over last year on the nuclear sub Kazan. To the best of my knowledge, there are no Russian ships that have come in. The one interesting piece of the puzzle is that there is a new Chinese Navy medical ship that about 2.5 weeks ago left Asia to do a medical mission, which supposedly was going to bring it to Mexico and then through the Panama Canal and then into the Caribbean. And so it would be interesting, complicating things, if that medical ship shows up, probably with a lot of electronic intelligence gathering capabilities right in the middle of where the U.S. is doing operations. We'll see if that happens or not. But even in the case of China, while China, I'm sure, will continue to protest against the use of force and the resolution of conflict, except in those cases where China is the one using the force. But I suspect that at the end of the day, it's remarkably how little China also has done to try to either offer to mediate or to try to offer to, in some way protect Maduro. And so Maduro has discovered that, his extra hemispheric friends, when it's not in their interest to stick up for Maduro, are suddenly keeping their heads very low.
Yeah, this must be coming as a surprise to him. And obviously, this is the Caribbean. You're talking about the Chinese ship coming into the Caribbean. It's a good segue into to discuss the other neighbors to Venezuela. Of course, as you mentioned, the Essequibo region, disputed by Venezuela, massive oil-producing region, changing Guyana immensely. In fact, the most recent episode we've done here has been on Guyana's new political situation. And Guyana and Irfan Ali has been asking for a mature conversation. When he says something like that, what does he mean? A mature conversation about what's going on in the Southern Caribbean?
It's a great question. And first of all, of course, I think now right after the elections in which the PPP was returned to power, I think that gives a bit more of confidence and stability to the current Guyanese government to continue forward its line. But really, the way that Venezuela has behaved with respect to the Essequibo claim has been just absolutely irresponsible and bullying. I mean, you can go without reciting the entire history of the conflict, but the Venezuelan claim is basically based on a finding of one of the judges involved that there may have been a collusion and bribery of the Russian judge in the 5-member arbitration panel, again back in 1899, and the commitment that we would resolve this difference by peaceful, and we would only go to other means if peaceful means could not be resolved. Well, ironically, it was actually just a couple of years ago when, after Venezuela had basically detained two Exxon, essentially, seismic and measuring boats that were trying to exploit those legitimate claims in what has been legitimately Guyanese water since 1899 in that resolution. It was only after that, and after Venezuela first declared a military identification zone, a ZODI, claiming that territory, and then did a series of other things, that they said, okay, we, the Secretary General are going to take this to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ. In other words, consistent with the agreed to resolution mechanism, we're going to take this to the court, and that will be how this is resolved. But despite that, you had these continuing other activities. The Venezuelans, I think largely for internal political reasons, held a referendum in which they voted among Venezuelans who would be, whether the Venezuelans wanted Esquibo to become a new Venezuelan state. And of course, in that rigged election, it came out yes. And then they actually literally held elections for people that would represent Venezuela in what is legally still Guyanese territory. And they've done a number of different military provocations, ironically, with Iranian, the Zulk boats with the adapted Chinese missiles and other capabilities. At the end of the day, my Guyanese friends that I talk to at some fairly senior level really don't take this seriously, in part because Maduro knows that right now, if he sent his army into Esquibo, that you get them away from their Cuban minders and away from their internal GGCIM minders and controllers, that and you essentially embarrass them in the middle of the Esquibo brush, where there is again very limited logistics capability. It would make the mess that Russia got into when they tried to move on Kiev look like look like a cakewalk. And so I think there's the understanding that the worst thing that Maduro could possibly do in terms of his own survival would be that type of just what would be a complete military failure and an embarrassment, trying to send the military into Esquibo. So it's not really seen as a legitimate or serious threat, and certainly not now with such U.S. forces in the region. I think the Guyana Defense Force and Guyana is very comforted by that. But I think really what President Ali is getting at is that Guyana has tried to do this by the books in terms of the ICJ ruling. Okay, let's resolve this in ICJ. And even when the Venezuelans were doing these threats and provocations in elections, they went to the ICJ to get a legal resolution to this rather than responding by force. And despite everything else with the Argyle Accords, they said, okay, you're threatening us. This is supposed to be the channel, but you want to talk, we'll talk. And even in those talks and commitments, the Venezuelans haven't led up to it. So I think clearly what President Ali is wanting is that, that whoever is the regime in Venezuela, resolves this in a way that's consistent with their past commitments, with diplomacy, with the established structures of the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice.
And Guyana, of course, we've mentioned Colombia, and we have to discuss the Trinidad, so close there to Venezuela. Is this a possible jumping off spot as well for the U.S., Trinidad into Venezuela, or using it as a strategic partner or base?
Right now, I seriously doubt it. But it is clear that the new government and Kamala's new government is obviously aligned itself more closely with the United States, more closely with President Trump than the previous rally government had. But also, I think it's important to remember the context, which is that literally the Gulf of Paria, Trinidad and Tobago being at some point 7 miles or less from Venezuela. For years and years, as the situation in Venezuela has degenerated, you've had Venezuelans going into Trinidad, staying there, overwhelming the relatively modest population. You've had difficulties with some of the criminal activity that's been associated with that, human trafficking activity. The refugees alone, the undocumented refugees going in Trinidad and Tobago, because it's literally right there and had relative prosperity in supplies, have overwhelmed Trinidad and Tobago schools and other things, and become a major issue for that government, even under the previous administration of Prime Minister Ali. And so this idea that Venezuela has long been a security problem, it's long been an economic problem, it's long been a problem for criminality. So My sense is that just the resolution of the situation in Venezuela for Trinidad and Tobago, and a sense that there's some attention to a problem that has so directly impacted them. I think that is what's most welcome for them. And frankly, their other concern is that just like, and of course, they're not that far from the Venezuelan claims to the territory of Esquivel. And so they understand that, if you're going to move into one territory, that, they are a relatively small bi-island, state as well. And so I think that sense of saying to Maduro that if you dare make a military move against Esquivel, if you do something like that, Trinidad and Tobago will welcome the United States in to defend their territory. So they're not saying we will allow Trinidad and Tobago to be used as a U.S. forward base in a military operation against Maduro. I think what they're saying is that if Maduro dares to attack, they only then are prepared in the defense of their own sovereignty to accept U.S. or British or other forces to defend their sovereignty, and not necessarily to be used for political change or operations against criminal elements in Venezuela. At least that's how I understand it.
And is there a concern, of course, let's say the U.S. launches this attack, the bunkers and so on, a word that Secretary of War Hegseth says a lot is kinetic attack, and we hope it is, and we hope that anything directed at Venezuela takes out the people that need to be taken out in this circumstance. But my fear is that again the people on the ground are the ones who are most going to suffer. Again, a mass exodus of those who are left, of course, going into Colombia, into neighboring countries. Has this been, do you think, been figured into the plans that the U.S. might be putting together?
Well, certainly it's I have not been under the table during some of those what are obviously very sensitive negotiations, but I think it's important to look at two separate pieces of this. One is what would likely be the operation itself, and number two, what could be maybe or maybe not the outcome. So the operation itself, again, there's long-standing templates for these type of things, especially in the current domain of warfare. If you look even to go back historically at what happened with the operations in Iraq, essentially what's likely would be a massive initial strike that would take down most of the largely Russian, somewhat Chinese air defenses. They would probably take out most of the key command nodes. They would probably take out a series of the fighters, which, as I believe your readers know, have already been distributed across the country in anticipation of that. You would probably have special forces on the ground. You would probably have, or probably long have had, intelligence assets who are cutting the deals, so that essentially Maduro would be secured until they could get to him, or maybe even taken to a spot where he could be taken out by helicopter. You might have operations against 3 or 4 or 10 simultaneous objectives to get as many of the key leadership nodes, and probably an element of deception as well. There would be some risk that that maybe a handful of Sukhoi 30s got off the ground. Of course, that's why you've got the F-35s there in Puerto Rico. That would be more of an overmatch for them. But everything else is just political theater. I'm sure where the relatively undisciplined, recently trained militia elements are is well understood, and probably the objective would be to go in and go out and avoid those things. There probably would be negotiations with commanders who know that it would be utterly senseless to oppose a rapidly coming in U.S. force, and have long since not believed in Maduro anyway. So it's like, okay, do you essentially commit suicide with your troops for a leader that you don't believe in, that you anticipate very soon will not be with you anymore, or do you cooperate with the gringos? And so my sense is the operation itself would probably be a relatively low casualty affair and a relatively short-lived affair. Phase 2 is when it really starts getting complicated, which is that phase we just talked about, where you likely have a turn to the legitimate governments and leaders pledging their loyalties. And so if that holds together and you have only limited violence, in terms of having to clean up operations against some of the unruly colectivos, against ELN elements and sindicatos and others that want to cause problems, then the impact on Venezuela's neighbors would be relatively modest. Where the risk comes is if that begins to spiral out of control. If you start getting a split in the army, some who are fighting for, some who are fighting against, you have sustained terrorism attacks against the refineries, which I'm sure is exactly what's in plan A, B, and C for the Russians and the Cubans and everyone else. But if you get that type of chaos, yes, there's a risk of immigrant outflows. Ironically, Colombia, as Petro probably understands, would bear the brunt of that, just as they've bared the brunt of I think at least more than 3 million who've flowed through Catatumbo and elsewhere, although the Caribbean and others would feel some of that as well. In terms of the criminal activities, ironically, some of that would actually probably be more contained because you would have more of an imperative to control the violence than there is now when there's not as much of an acceptance of it. So I think the long answer short is that it on net, in a number of different ways, it would be mostly positive. But yes, absolutely, in terms of refugee outflows and in terms of some spillover of violence, yes, there is a risk to those neighbors, especially Colombia, if that were to happen.
I think it's a very interesting situation. And of course, we've discussed, let's say, the best case scenario as well, everything going well, as you said, sort of low body count, let's say, and then the hard part being phase 2. I would fear, of course, my overwhelming and my negative feel on this is if it wasn't followed through correctly, and Maduro and a cadre of savvy or allied generals, and Diosdado Cabello, Delcy Rodriguez, and others stayed in power, the worst case scenario is greater repression. And I mean, it would be far worse than where they are today. I don't know how if we just put into theoreticals, everything's hypothetical and theoretical right now before anything happens. But what could you see happening in a worst case scenario?
It's a great question. And as you point out, there's a lot of different permutations of essentially who stays in power. And so, you could imagine, again, to expand a little bit the possibilities, number one, that President Trump, worrying about the chaos, decides not to commit, does some sort of deal with Maduro in which he commits to, accept refugees, change policies, give license to Chevron, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then again, that essentially kicks the can down the road because, and maybe even Maduro, commits to kick the Russians out. I mean, I think that would be a big grasp. But I think that would only really cause the problem to fester and probably give other leftist leaders in the region greater, courage to challenge the U.S. in other areas, and especially Brazil and Lula. On the other hand, if you had a situation where you had a small group of leaders, let's say, and for me this is crazy but not unthinkable, somebody like Jorge Rodriguez and Delcy Rodriguez, who really have been the cynical dark knights in this, far more intelligent than Maduro. But if they, cut the deal with President Trump and Rick Grenell, saying, hey, we will kick the Russians out and we will kick the Cubans out because the Cubans basically don't trust the Rodriguez anyway, then they solve one of their problems with their rivals, but you then have a cynical, arguably even more capable criminal element and an even bigger problem, although the U.S. might be declaring victory. Although that problem probably gets you, as you alluded to, a lot more repression, but it doesn't necessarily get you to instability. The other scenario that we talked about briefly is again where you have a lack of clarity, where you have perhaps the taking out of the key leadership elements, but you have a second tier group of generals that have been involved in criminality and that have cut deals. They are pardoned or they're worked with, and so the new democratic regime has a legitimacy crisis. You have these leaders trying to protect themselves from being held accountable if there are future Truth and Reconciliation Commission things. You have, again, probably some of the things that will be on the table with the Cubans and the Russians will be to try to sabotage the oil production. Those refineries are an enormous target, big vulnerability, and of course they know just how to bring Venezuelan oil to a standstill, trying to deepen the problem. And so that probably from an insecurity standpoint is probably the worst of the worst, where you essentially have the bringing of oil flows to a halt, vast environmental damage. You have violence and contested sovereignty in different parts of the more inaccessible parts of Venezuela, possibly a split between ambiguous loyalties, different elements. And again, in that you would certainly see a much bigger outflow of Venezuelan refugees, largely through Colombia and in other places. So that probably is your kind of festering nightmare scenario, the question of where that goes to. But I think kind of going with the current of what I'm getting at, the worrisome thing, the good news is that not all scenarios are as bad as you think. The bad news is there are actually lots of nightmare scenarios that are problematic in different ways. And those are the type of things that I'm sure that the people in the White House and at state are probably wrestling with right now as they try to calibrate how to proceed.
So, I mean, as we wind this down, but I think we could listen for hours on variables and variations. Could we just then put to bed the issue that this mobilization in the Caribbean is to combat narco trafficking and the transportation of fentanyl produced in Venezuela up to the United States? It's about regime change in Venezuela.
Well, to be a little bit nuanced, I would not say it's about regime change per se. I would say it's essentially about eliminating a strategic risk that is causing damage to the U.S. Now, you can say, well, which part of the damage to U.S. strategic interests is the core of the focus right now? Right now, with this Trump administration, the focus is on the essentially drug transit criminality portion of the damage more than it is the working with the Russians, Iranians, Chinese, and being authoritarian dictators part of the problem. But my sense is that it's never been for President Trump about regime change per se, but about dealing with problems. But to go to your point more directly, to me it is clearly about more than drug boats leaving Venezuela. But President Trump, but the message has never been it's just about the drug boats. If you just stop sending drug boats, then everything is okay. You see that with the contemplation of land targets. Clearly the designation of the Cartel de los Soles and Tren de Aragua specific to Venezuela as terrorist entities and going after them and saying that we are in a state of armed conflict, which is the president's current legal position. Again, what that tells you is that it goes far beyond just boats crossing the shores, and it goes to essentially the adversary, Cartel de los Soles, with which you're in armed conflict. So to me, the key thing is this is about putting an end to a significant strategic threat to U.S. interests that are threatening the core of things that President Trump said he was going to defend, issues of migration, issues of drugs, and in other things. It's not, for the Venezuelan people, and I am I keep my fingers crossed, and I am a strong advocate personally of the importance of restoring Venezuelan democracy, and I think that Venezuelans have never had a better opportunity than Edmundo González and María Corina Machado to reunite a deeply divided country. But for me, my sense is that the way that the current administration, the U.S. administration, is looking at this challenge is it's more through the lens of a threat that is generating harms against the United States, and the drugs are the first little piece of that, but it's about those harms more than about the democracy. And I think, in all fairness, President Trump would say, well, absolutely, we want the restoration of democracy to Venezuela, but the question is it that, or is it about the harms to the U.S. that is most motivating the prioritization that clearly the president's given? And to me, it's the prioritization of but again, to bring this part to a close, saying, okay, if it's about stopping the harms, there may still be deals. Maybe they're suboptimal deals, maybe they're counterproductive deals, maybe they're deals that don't pay off in the long run. But if you're saying it is about stopping harms to the U.S., there probably are deals that the president could choose to make or pursue in that space.
And finally, then, if you're a betting man, you said as we move into November, December, if and the suggestion is that there will be, or most likely will be, some sort of targeted attack at a bunker or some sort. Let's just put that up. Would you place it being November, December, or into January? Do you have any idea?
Well, let me just say, number one, I've never made a lot of money betting, and number two, this is purely speculation on my part. But my sense of the general dynamics is that the president, just like with Fordo, just like with Israel, is not in a hurry. I mean, the MAGTF, the Marine Air Ground Task Force, can stay out there for easily 6 months, and you can still switch out ships and switch out crews. But you know, I think right now we're in the process of escalation. I think we're in the process of the president saying, okay, well, you don't take me seriously. Well, I can do this. Well, I can do this. Well, I can do this. And so, again, we're moving from, attacks against U.S. ships, which I suspect will continue. The other thing that wasn't well understood, for example, was the F-35 flights, which, the Venezuelans say this is an incursion on our sovereignty. But the reality is that, everyone who is actually serious military understand that, essentially to the extent that those were F-35s, what they were probably doing is mapping out the location of radars and defenses and their ability to react. And because the S-300 Russian systems are semi-mobile, so if somebody's mapping out your presence and your signatures, knowing that you can move, does that tell you that an attack is coming within hours? It's coming within days. And so I think there's a lot of signaling in psychological operations. But at the end of the day, when the Venezuelan military presumes that something is just signaling, that's when it's going to be real. But, things like the discussion of strikes against ground targets, maybe against a plane, maybe against leader targets in Venezuela itself, maybe small scale operations involving boots on the ground with special operations forces. I suspect that we're going to be seeing an escalating series of things, because just like with the Iran negotiations, I think what the president really wants is to resolve this without the U.S. having to commit to force. But my sense, again, this is just my personal sense from having been in the first administration and having understood that the president must be deeply frustrated that he had to pass power to Joe Biden while Nicolas Maduro stayed in power in Venezuela. And if that weren't enough, you also have Marco Rubio and Chris Landau at State, who understand deeply the nature of this threat. So for me, it's very difficult to see the cutting of a deal. So I tend to pick kind of November, December by ways of saying, it's not to say nothing would happen or could happen. I mean, because sometimes you get a attack just when you least expect it, and that's kind of the point of surprise. But my sense is by November, December, you've probably run out of some of the big escalatory options, and then you're just repeating things. You kind of have a sense of whether the Venezuelan military is too penetrated by the Cubans, too penetrated by Sabine, too fearful to turn or not. And so I think by that point, on the one hand, it's getting close to Christmas. You don't want to put this past Christmas, and you say, okay, we know that the other things aren't going to produce the limited results. We've got a high probability of success. You've had the opportunity to have those talks with the opposition, so which units are going to stand down when you come in. Who's going to betray. Maria Corina is that opportunity to kind of get her day one plan refined and into place. And so it seems a pretty logical point that if you don't get a transition before then, that that seems like a logical trigger date. Again, it's not necessary. And again, I go back to the idea that it is still entirely possible that if there's some great deal that Maduro and Rodriguez offer up, then you could yet go back to that deal, cut a deal again. Maybe it involves Chevron kicking out the Russians, kicking out the Chinese, and a great Trump hotel in downtown Caracas. I don't know, but so at the end of the day, I come to put a number on it. I say 50-50. 50-50 that you either get, on the one hand, unilateral action by the Venezuelan military or a U.S. operation that takes out Maduro and the leadership, versus 50% that they come to some deal, some way of essentially solving this for now and moving on to the next thing. But again, I've never been a betting man, but for your podcast, I'm glad to invent numbers.
Well, I'm happy to have got some figures out of you there, Evan. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. We are obviously watching and waiting with deep interest of what's going on. I'm obviously based in Colombia, and you're up in the United States, so we're very much involved in the region of the Southern Caribbean, what's going on between the United States and Venezuela and how it might play out. I'll take this moment to thank Dr. Evan Ellis, of the Latin American Research Professor and General MacArthur Research Chair at the U.S. Army War College. Thank you so much for your time and your incredibly in-depth insights into possibilities and variables for the immediate future in Venezuela.
Thank you, Richard. A real pleasure, as always, to do this podcast with you.
The pleasure is ours, of course. This has been the Latin News Podcast. I've been your host, Richard McCall, here in Colombia. And of course, remember to share and subscribe, and we'll be back in a fortnight with further issues from the region. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.